Okay then, this podcast is going to be about the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. Now this is one of my personal favourites really, because it's just a little story that you need to remember, and then the consequences that led from the Peasants' Revolt. So to put it in some context for you, if you were a peasant in the 1300s, your life was pretty damn awful, and I'm not going to make any bones about that. So what had been happening for them? Well, there were summary laws that told them, what they could do, what they had to wear and those types of things, so their life was totally controlled. There was also lots of problems with landlords, because the landlords wanted obviously the peasants to work on the land, and they just kept charging them more and more rent in terms of getting the land off them, so that was terrible for them. There was droughts, there was famines, which was absolutely horrific and things as well. And to make it worse, in the 1300s, in the 1340s, there'd been something called the Black Death. Now the Black Death had ended up killing 50% of peasants who lived in England. So straight after the Black Death, the landlords were prepared to pay them higher wages because they were doing more work, which seemed okay, that seemed fair enough. But then, unfortunately, the Statute of Labourers was brought in, and then what that said, which is absolutely shocking, is that they couldn't get paid more than they did before the Black Death happened, even though they were doing twice as much work. So the peasants were not happy over that, but the final nail in the coffin for them was the poll tax that was introduced. Now this was the equivalent to 2 weeks' wages for a peasant, and what that was, it was 1 shilling 4d. So they were absolutely horrified. There was no two ways about it when they got charged the poll tax, because what they couldn't understand is why should they have to get charged the poll tax? Why is that going to be the case? Because it's really just a living tax and they can't afford it anyway. So they'd had enough. Everyone has the breaking point, and the peasants literally had it up to here. Absolutely had it up to here. So really they've got nothing to lose in terms of revolting. So when the king's tax collectors go to Essex to try and collect in, the tax money, they decide that they're not going to pay it because they say they've already paid it and they're not paying any more. Now what happens, it's a bit like dominoes, because then it spreads to another village and another village and another village in the south, and then they're all refusing to pay it. So what they do is the peasants sort of come together, thousands of them, and they start marching towards London. Now when they get towards London, the gates of London are actually closed, but because the people in London feel sorry for them, they open the gates to let them in. Now, just so that we're clear, they don't actually blame the 14-year-old King Richard II for this, because obviously he's very young and he'd only come on the throne at 10 years old, so they think it's his advisors. So they're absolutely baying for the blood of John of Gaunt, who's the king's uncle, the treasurer and the archbishop, okay? They're baying for their blood. So they're all so scared, those people go to the Tower of London, and what happens on the way into London, they actually burn the palace of John Gaunt to the ground, so they show that they mean business. And they all go, with, sheaths and like arms and stuff that they've made from things that they'd usually use, to hit the wheat and barley and things down. So they go there fully armed. And then they break into the Tower of London, and then what they do is they manage to kill the treasurer and the archbishop. And they cut the heads off and they parade round London with the heads on spikes. So they're sending out a clear message here. What they really wanted, they had a certain list of demands, and this is what they say to King Richard II when they meet him. So King Richard II realises after they've been killed, he's going to have to go and meet with them. He has to meet with them, so this is really important. So he goes to meet with the rebels, okay, so he meets with the peasants, and they have demands, so it's things like anybody involved in this peasants' revolt won't have any repercussions, so nobody will be killed because they're involved in it. Also, all peasants wanted to be free, so they wanted to be free to choose who to work for, how much they can charge in terms of wages, so they wanted a much better life. They also wanted absolutely rid of the poll tax because they thought that was totally unfair. And they also wanted rid of people like, John of Gaunt, the king's uncle, who was obviously, they felt, were like, was pulling the strings. And the thing about it is that really, really were looking for improvements in their lives. That's what the peasants wanted. They'd had enough. They wanted something to happen that was going to make their lives better. So King Richard II listened to the demands and said he would consider them and that he would do these things and that everything would be fine, but the peasants, needed to go home. So the following day, he met some of the, hardcore rebels of the Peasants' Revolt, again at Smithfield. And the leader was Wat Tyler of the Peasants' Revolt. So he came up to the king, and it's all a little bit unclear exactly what happened. But it's definitely got something to do with Wat Tyler asking for water and spitting it out in front of the king. Now the problem is, people thought that maybe he was getting a little bit cocky, Wat Tyler, and was, trying to be a bit overconfident and showing no respect to the king. So apparently, it was either the Lord Mayor of London that stabbed Wat Tyler through, or the King's guards, but whatever happened, he was killed. And the rebels that were there obviously looked like they were then going to start to fight and riot. But the King Richard II, the young king, said, "What, will you kill your king?" And obviously the rebels weren't going to kill the king. They had no intention of killing the young king. So what happened is then the rebels are told to disperse and go home, and if they do that, all of the things that had been put forward, all of the demands would be met. So they start to go away, and then they go back to the villages. So it honestly looks like the power has shifted. It really does. It looks like that now the peasants have managed to get their voice heard, and there's more power to the people. But unfortunately, a few weeks later, King Richard II completely goes back on his word. He sends the King's Guard around to these villages like Essex and the ones that have rebelled, and 7,000 peasants are brutally murdered. So by the end of June, he is absolutely showing that he is the person in charge of England, not the peasants. He won't be dictated to. He is going to decide what happens in terms of, what happens with the peasantry in England, and he is not going to be told what to do. But the Peasants' Revolt was really, really significant, because what ended up happening with it was, although in the short term it looked like a disaster, in the long term it worked really, really well. Because in 70 years' time, after the Peasants' Revolt, all peasants were free, so they could choose who they were going to be able to work for. And also, the poll tax was abolished. So in terms of what they achieve in the long term, it really, really does work. And they do start to get better lives, the peasantry that are living in England. And something that is important to remember as well, Wat Tyler was held up as a bit of a hero. Lots of primary schools and roads in London are named after him. And when there was the poll tax revolt that happened in 1989 and 90, which was about the one that Margaret Thatcher brought in terms of this living tax for people, and everyone had to pay the same amount no matter how much they earned, they followed the exact same route that the peasants had during the Peasants' Revolt. So it hadn't been forgotten, even 600 years on. And they are victorious too, because in the end, the Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government has to stop the poll tax because of all of this public unrest. So if anything can be taken from this, yes, actually, peasants and the normal everyday people can start to take a little bit of that power back from the people at the top if they just make the voices heard.